But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Again, this is the record of Paul's voyage to Rome as a prisoner. It is a detailed narrative revealing the providence of God in life, containing many lessons, many truths for you and I. For the most part, it is a description of a storm and a shipwreck, and again filled with reminders concerning life. And it's also a record that, as we see in many other places, that Paul's life was spiritually impactful and influential. And that's what we want to speak upon. Impactful and influential lives. Jesus declared in the Sermon on the Mount that our lives as God's people are to be impactful, and they are to be influential. They are to make a difference for good. He said, Ye are the salt of the earth. Ye are the light of the world. And those are present tense. It's never not so. We're to always be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. That speaks of impact. Salt makes impact. Light makes impact. It speaks of influence. Salt influences whatever it comes into contact with. Light does the same. So we are not an island to ourselves. Those two statements in the Sermon on the Mount, you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world, show the importance of our lives in this world. There are very few people who have any awareness whatsoever of the importance of their life in the world. I'm not talking about the feeling of importance. I'm talking about the importance of a life lived in the world. Our lives are to be different and distinct from our surroundings. So what we see here in the Sermon on the Mount is a statement of the seriousness of life. You are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. What a life is ours to live. In this 27th chapter, we see, as we have already mentioned, a picture of life. And we see God's hand in it all. And if we are going to be spiritually impactful and influential, our focus, our attention, our trust, our conviction must be God. So notice some truths about our lives. God puts a variety of people in our lives. In verse 1, there are with Paul certain other prisoners. And these by the providence of God. They're not there by accident. Paul and these certain other prisoners were committed to the charge of one named Julius. And we read that he is a centurion of Augustus' band. And in verse 3, he, Julius, courteously entreated Paul. That is, he treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go unto his friends and refresh himself. So we have these certain other prisoners with Paul. We have Julius, and we have his friends, that is, Paul's friends. In life, kindness and favor at times comes from unlikely and unexpected sources, as it did here with Paul. Julius didn't have to, wasn't under any obligation to treat Paul kindly. I'm sure Paul was not expecting Julius to treat him kindly. Kindness comes from unlikely and unexpected sources at times. That's all of God. Paul had obviously gained the confidence of the centurion by the life that he was living before him. That was no accident. The friends that are mentioned are people that Paul came to know through the missionary journeys. That was no accident. Whoever you meet in life, there's no accident. You may only see him one time. You may see him many times. But it's no accident. And now we see these friends that Paul would have met during his missionary journeys are a source of refreshing to him. In verse 2, there is a man who would be listed amongst his friends, but he's pointed out, Aristarchus, also, again, one of Paul's close friends. And he also, by the providence of God, is with Paul at this time. He's identified in Acts chapter 19, verse 29, as a companion of Paul in travel. So this isn't the first time that this man has traveled with Paul. Colossians 4, verse 10, he's a fellow prisoner. And in Philippians, verse 24, he's a fellow laborer. So it's no accident that this man has traveled with Paul and would labor with Paul and would even be in prison with Paul. And it's no accident that he's with Paul at this time. And there's Luke. He's never mentioned, but he's the writer of the account, and he speaks of himself in first person plural 18 times in the chapter, using the pronoun we. And it's no accident that Luke was with him at this time. Again, Luke's a physician. And what we see here is God always has a people in place for His own. You don't necessarily know who those people are going to be. But God has a people in place for His own. In verse 37, we are told all total, there were 276 people on board the ship. Very important, they are viewed as souls. The very last word of verse 37. Always view people in your life as souls. That changes perspective. Then it doesn't matter what color their skin is or where they're from or how they talk. changes perspective. Everything's not focused upon lifestyle. We need to get back. That's a soul. That's a soul that needs a Lord. That needs to be our perspective. It changes the emphasis. There are a variety of changes in life, as we mentioned earlier. In our text, there's the word when 18 times. The word for 4 times. And again, these are words indicative of time, indicative of connecting events. And there are many whens and thens in life. But notice, going through Acts 27 here, it begins, and when. In verse 4, and when. In verse 5, and when. In verse 7, and when. In verse 9, now when, and when. In verse 13, and when. In verse 14, but not long after. Verse 15, and when. Verse 17, which when. In verse 20, and when. And then, third word from the end, then. And it just goes on and on throughout the chapter. Verse 27, but when. Verse 28, and when. Verse 30, when. Verse 35, and when. Verse 36, then. And verse 38, and when. Verse 39, and when. Verse 40, and when. Verse 40, and when, we've already mentioned. So all this is indicative of change. And God directs all change. And Paul knows that. And Paul is firmly persuaded in such. In verse 4, there are contrary winds. In verse 7, this caused slow sailing. In verse 8, they almost shipwreck. In verse 9, it was a time-consuming and dangerous matter. In verse 13, there was a south wind blowing softly. But then coming to verse 14, not long after, a tempestuous wind. And the ship is now trapped in a fierce and inescapable storm. A storm that would result in the ship being broken to pieces. And God's directing it all. God's hand is in it all. Next, in chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, they are safely to land. And God has a barbarous people there who showed them much kindness, providing comfort for them. So throughout the account, there are changes from favorable circumstances to unfavorable and vice versa. Life is full of change. And it is no accident. In the account, there is comfort and rest, and there is also terrible discomfort and utter misery. There is ease, and there is great toil and weariness. There is apparent safety, and there is great danger. There is hope, and there is hopelessness. Life is full of change. Change involving ourselves, change involving our surroundings, change involving our happenings and situations, changes in others in our lives. Life is full of change. It is a constant flux of change. But in it all is Almighty, all-knowing, all-sufficient God, ruling over all the change. So what are we to be in life? And that's what we want to consider today. What are we to be? That's what matters. What are we to be in life? And we can see this in Paul. First of all, Paul was willing to give himself entirely to the will of God. Back in Acts chapter 20, verses 22 through 24, Paul stated his intent in following the will of the Lord. He said that he was bound in spirit. That is a powerful compulsion, a driving force working within him to do the will of God. He states that bonds and afflictions did not deter him from doing the Lord's will. And then he states the key to it all. This is why he was bound in spirit, and bonds and afflictions did not move him. Neither count I my life dear unto myself. That's the key. That's the key to it all. And the reason is because he saw a greater cause, so that I might finish my course. And may I say that is the course that God has designed, and not the course that we have designed. Many times, well, this is what I've been planning for 15 years or whatever. So what? What's your point? It really doesn't matter. It's His course, the course that He has set. That's what we need to be interested in. That's what needs to pique our interest. What is the course that God has designed for me? Not the course that I've designed for myself. That I might finish my course with joy and the ministry which I have received. As children of God, that is how we are to face life. Now, in that statement, he mentions my life, myself. There must, if we're going to be what we ought to be, there must be a right perspective concerning my life, myself. Because those two things, more than anything else, will get in the way of serving God. In our text verses, he plainly states concerning God whose I am and whom I serve. And then back in Acts chapter 20, neither count I my life dear unto myself. My life and myself. He viewed these and everything about them as belonging to God. My life belongs to God. Myself belongs to God. My life is to be spent serving the Lord. My entire self is to be in the service of the Lord. So regarding life in this world, we must have a proper perspective of our life and ourself. If we're going to be spiritually impactful, spiritually influential, we must have a proper perspective. My life. And what is that proper perspective? My life belongs to Him. My life is to be spent serving Him. My life is to be spent believing Him. So Paul was willing to give himself entirely to the will of God. There aren't many who really even have an interest in the will of God. It's a term that people throw around, and it's blasphemous the way they use it. God was also relevant to Paul. There was an awareness of God. Verse 23 of our text, for there stood by me. He stood by me. He was right there. By me. This night. An angel of God. The angel of God was very real. This night was very real. Paul could see the this night. He could feel the this night. He was personally experiencing the this night. And he says, the Lord stood by me this night. And he felt and experienced the presence of God. In fact, the presence of God was more real to him than the this night. This is very important. God was relevant. The this night was reality. But so was, and even more so, there stood by me the angel of God. There was also the present voice of God. There stood by me the angel of God, saying. Now you think about it. There were many voices on that ship that night. Can you imagine? Paul heard one voice. He heard the voice of God. That's what we need to hear. There are voices all around us. And they can be quite upsetting. And they can, if we let them, they can ruin our day and dominate our day. There's voices everywhere. But the voice we need to hear is the voice of God. And that's what Paul heard. There stood by me the angel of God, saying. So he's experiencing and living in the presence of God. He's hearing God. And that is how you have spiritual impact and influence. What he heard was a personal message. God called him by name, saying, "Fear not, Paul." He's heard that voice before. It's the same voice that he heard on the Damascus Road. God has something to say. God has something to say to each one of us. God has something to say about everything. We need to hear His voice. But we are very prone to hear all the other voices. But we need to hear God speaking to us. What God said to him was an exhortation. Fear not. But it was also a message of comfort. A message of encouragement. It was a message of revelation. Not new revelation, it's just a message of revelation. Thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Throughout life, throughout all the changes of life, we need to feel God standing by us. We need to know He's there. We need to hear what God is saying to us. That needs to have an impact upon us. We need to receive it. In other words, God was relevant reality to Paul. And then Paul states, I believe God. And notice that it shall be even as it was told me. He is saying, I have confidence in God. He is with me. He is speaking to me. I am hearing Him, and I am firmly persuaded and assured in Him. I am depending upon Him. I am trusting Him. I am leaning upon Him. I am resting upon Him. I am embracing Him. Paul is gripped by who and what God is. He's not gripped by the storm. He's gripped by who and what God is. Oh, how careful we must be to what grips us. A lot of things can get a hold of us. We need to be gripped by who and what God is. This is how we are a spiritual impact and spiritual influence. He believed that God was in sovereign control. Verse 25, "For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." Doesn't look like it right now, but I believe God. God says I must be brought before Caesar. In other words, I'm going to be safely brought to land. It certainly doesn't look like it, but I believe God. That's how we are spiritual impact and influence. Will you believe God regardless? Regardless of what things look like. You face life believing God. You face every situation in life believing God. That's the way to be spiritually impactful and influential. Verse 21, Luke says, Paul stood forth. And when he stood forth, he demonstrated to all that were on board that it's all about God. And our lives ought to be a demonstration of that. Paul stood forth and he demonstrated. He manifested faith in God. This is how to live above the happenings of life. Believe God. This is how to think right. If you take God out of the equation, your thinking is skewed. Believe God. That's how you think right. Keep your eyes on God. That's how you think right. It's how that we're not mastered and controlled and governed by the happenings of life. Believe God. Believe God. Believe God. That's how to ascend spiritually. That's how to stay connected to God. Believe God. This is victory. This is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. This is how to have spiritual impact and influence. Also, we see Paul's life was a ministry. In verse 22, Paul gives exhortation, be of good cheer. Followed by a reason for doing so. Verse 23 and 24, he states the basis of the reason. The basis of the reason is the Lord. And this is followed by verse 25, by encouragement. So here's how it worked. Paul received of the Lord. He received a message from God. He received of the Lord, and he dispensed what he received. And that is how you minister to others. You receive from the Lord, and you dispense what you receive. If you do that, your life will be spiritually impactful. Your life will be spiritually influential. So, spiritual impact and influence does not happen by becoming our surroundings. I believe everyone in that ship, they're feared. There's chaos everywhere in the ship. Paul could have joined in. He would have been of no influence. He'd have been of no spiritual influence had he become his surroundings. But Luke specifically notes, and Paul stood forth. He's different. He's different than his surroundings. And that must be so if we're going to have spiritual impact and influence. So there he is, standing forth. Different. Paul stood forth. And when he did, though he's in the same surroundings as others, he's different. He's different. The way to be of spiritual impact and influence, again, receive from God, share what you receive. And that's what Paul did when he stood forth. He shared what he had received from God. We need to face life knowing that our lives involve others. Always does. Our life involves others. And our life is to be a ministry. This implies that we have a responsibility to others. We have a duty to others. We have a function. We have a role concerning those whom God puts in our lives. Doesn't affect those whom aren't in our lives. God puts people in our lives. And they're there on purpose. We may not appreciate the people in our lives. We don't appreciate everyone that's in our lives. Let's just be honest. Don't even like everyone that God puts into our lives. But we're to view them as souls. And we have a responsibility. And we have a duty and a function and a role concerning them. And we may not even know what that duty is. But whatever it is, it's for the honor and glory of God. And we are to face life realizing that life is not about being ministered to. Jesus stated it in Matthew 20:28, but ministering. So on board that ship were 275 other souls. And because of Paul's relation to the Lord, which greatly affected his perception of himself and his life that night was spiritually impactful and influential to them. Paul's life was a spiritual influence to those whom God put in his life. Paul's life was spiritually inspirational and motivational when he stood up and said what he said. That was inspirational. That was motivational to those whom God put in his life. Again, it gets back to neither count I my life dear unto myself. And it gets back to his relation to God, whose I am and whom I serve. I believe God. And it has its basis in receiving from God and sharing what is received. We all have a life to live. We all have an appointed time to live that life. None of us know when that appointed time is going to end. We have no idea when it's going to end. But we all have a life, and the life we have is to be lived, and it is lived within the appointed time that God has given us. And that life is made up of a variety of places. We go to many places throughout life. It's made up of many events. Some places we enjoy, some places we don't enjoy. But it doesn't change the life that we're to live. Some events we like, some events we don't like. That doesn't change the life that we are responsible to live. It's made up of many circumstances. Some we like, some we don't. Some we would choose, some we would never choose. But it doesn't change the life that we are to live. Life is made up of many different conditions. Life is made up of a variety of people. And our lives are to matter. When we have lived our life upon earth, at the end of that life, our lives are to matter. They don't have to have worldwide effect to matter. But they do have to have positive effect upon those whom God puts into our lives. I'm not responsible for someone that God doesn't put into my life. I can't do anything. But everyone God puts in our lives, and that could be just meeting someone for 2 minutes. But we're not to be a hindrance to them in any way, spiritually. Our lives are to matter and to have positive spiritual impact and influence in the lives of others. Our lives should make the lives of others better. That's what Paul did that night on that ship. His life made their lives better. It really did. The life of a child of God should never be a spiritual detriment to anyone. Should not be a spiritual hindrance. Should not be a spiritual drain upon the lives of others. I've known people, you've known people, that's all they are. That's all they are. They're a drain. They're a drain upon everyone that comes into contact with them. And that's sad. It's really sad to spend the only life that God has given us and be a spiritual drain upon everyone around us. We ought to desire our lives to be spiritually impactful and influential. And the basis of that gets back to our relation to God. That's what matters. Our relation to God. Have to keep the order right. Relationship to God. Now we can have spiritual impact and spiritual influence. You can never get away from the main matter. My relationship to God. Brother Dave, if you'd come and